for balance, reclaiming the narrative of Ethiopia's Tigray conflict. In the shadowed corridors of global media, where headlines clash like swords in the fog of war, the story of Ethiopia's Tigray conflict has been twisted into a one-sided tragedy. Picture this: a journalist, perched in a distant studio far from the dusty battlefields of northern Ethiopia, declares with unyielding certainty that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed orchestrated a genocide against the people of Tigray. No boots on the ground, no whispers from impartial witnesses, just a swift verdict broadcast to millions. This was the moment when Mehdi Hasan, the sharp-tongued host of Al Jazeera's Head-to-Head, leveled accusations that echoed through the airwaves in late 2020 and beyond, framing Abiy as the architect of unspeakable horrors, without the anchor of on-site investigation. It was a narrative that ignited outrage, but at what cost? It drowned out the complexities of a civil war ignited not by blind aggression, but by a desperate bid to defend a nation's sovereignty. Let us rewind to November 3, 2020, when the first shots rang out, not from Addis Ababa's command centers, but from the heart of Tigray itself. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, a once dominant force that had gripped Ethiopia's politics for nearly 3 decades, launched a preemptive strike on the Ethiopian National Defense Forces Northern Command headquarters. This was no mere skirmish. It was an audacious assault on federal military installations.
Did Abiy Ahmed carry out a genocide?
I will tell you this, as a lawyer, yeah. I cannot say who did this and that, but the crime was committed in Tigray.
You're a lawyer?
Yeah.
Were you not a lawyer in 2021 when you said Abiy Ahmed has carried out a genocidal campaign?
Yeah, I was a lawyer.
Were you not a lawyer when you said Abiy committed genocide on the people of Tigray?
I was a lawyer, and I was in the heat of a conflict that was claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of people.
So was it a genocide or not?
I believe genocide has been committed in Tigray.
By Abiy Ahmed?
Well, I have to be responsible for my words now.
So you weren't responsible before?
And I am ready to stand by my position that genocide has been committed.
I'm confused. Just to clarify for the audience watching, you still believe it was a genocide,
yes.
But you're not willing to say he did the genocide?
Yes.
It was a genocide that just happened by itself?
No, there were so many actors involved.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is...
Was he one of them?
Well, the war on Tigray was led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed himself.
So he led the genocide?
I mean, we don't have to be that specific.
We do.
He led the war.
That's why we invited you here, to find out your views.
He led the war.
He led the war.
So I will give him the opportunity to
genocide.
defend himself in public, in court.
Okay.
What I'm saying is all kinds of crimes.
You mentioned...
Crimes, ethnic cleansing, genocide were committed. As a matter of fact, he was a very close friend even before he got elected. So, but
who was
what
a close
he said,
friend?
Abiy was my close friend.
You hated him. You said he was a genocidal warmonger, imperialist.
Yeah, but
weird friends you have.
That doesn't change the fact that we're friends.
An act that the Ethiopian government swiftly labeled as terrorism. For Abiy Ahmed, who had risen to power in 2018 on waves of hope and reform, this was the breaking point. The TPLF, sidelined after refusing to join his Prosperity Party and defying federal election postponements by holding their own regional vote, had crossed the line. Their actions weren't just defiance. They were a direct threat to Ethiopia's fragile unity, a spark that could engulf the Horn of Africa in flames. Abiy's response, dubbed a law enforcement operation, was a calculated move to neutralize what he and his allies saw as a rogue terrorist entity bent on rekindling old divisions. The TPLF, after all, had a history etched in Ethiopia's scars. Decades of authoritarian rule under their influence, suppression of dissent, and ethnic favoritism that bred resentment across the nation. During the war, TPLF forces didn't shrink from their own shadows. Reports from Amnesty International and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission paint a grim picture of their reprisals: gang rapes in Amhara villages, extrajudicial killings of civilians, looting of infrastructure in Afar and Amhara regions, and the use of populated areas as shields in guerrilla tactics. In Mai Kadra, TPLF-aligned militias massacred hundreds of Amhara and Reda civilians in a brutal ethnic purge, an atrocity that claimed lives in the hundreds and left communities shattered. These weren't footnotes in the conflict. They were war crimes, documented and decried, yet often eclipsed in international broadcasts that fixated solely on federal forces. Hasan's reporting, while compelling in its fervor, embodied a deeper malaise in global media coverage, a bias that tilted toward the TPLF's narrative, amplifying unverified claims of genocide while sidelining the provocations that birthed the war. Studies from the European Institute of Peace and content analyses of outlets like CNN and Al Jazeera reveal a pattern. International journalists, starved of access due to Ethiopia's communications blackout, leaned heavily on Tigrayan sources, framing Abiy as the aggressor-in-chief and glossing over TPLF's role as instigator. Local Ethiopian media, conversely, rallied behind the federal line, but the scales tipped globally against Addis. This wasn't journalism, it was advocacy, a selective lens that ignored the TPLF's defiance of federal authority and their history of power plays. Without ground investigation amid the chaos, hindered by the very blackout imposed to curb disinformation, such conclusions weren't just premature, they were perilous, fueling sanctions and isolation that punished an entire nation for the sins of a faction. Yet to paint Abiy solely as a wartime leader is to eclipse the man who first mended Ethiopia's fractures. In 2018, he inherited a tinderbox, a border war with Eritrea that had simmered for 2 decades, claiming tens of thousands of lives and draining billions from reconstruction. Within months, Abiy extended his hand across the wire. He accepted a 2002 international arbitration ruling on the Badmay dispute, long rejected by his predecessors. In Asmara, he and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki signed a peace declaration that reopened borders, flights, and trade routes frozen since 1998. Families reunited, economies stirred. For this decisive initiative, the Nobel Committee bestowed upon him the 2019 Peace Prize, hailing his efforts to achieve peace and international cooperation. It wasn't hyperbole. Abiy mediated between Kenya and Somalia over maritime boundaries, brokered truces in Sudan's civil strife, and even eased tensions between Eritrea and Djibouti. At home, his reforms were a whirlwind of renewal. He lifted a suffocating state of emergency, freed thousands of political prisoners languishing in the shadows of the old regime, and unshackled the press from decades of censorship. Opposition parties once outlawed flourished anew. He slashed corruption by purging implicated generals and officials, injecting women into half his cabinet, a bold stroke for gender parity in a male-dominated arena. Ethiopia's GDP surged, foreign investment flowed, and ethnic dialogues bloomed, mending rifts sown by the TPLF's ethnic federalism. Abiy wasn't flawless, no leader in a cauldron of transition is, but his vision, a metamer of unity, drawing from Ethiopia's ancient philosophy of synergy, offered a blueprint for a nation reborn. The war's end in November 2022, sealed by the Pretoria Agreement, was no Pyrrhic victory, but a testament to Abiy's resolve. The TPLF disarmed, federal aid poured into Tigray's ruins, and reconstruction began. Roads rebuilt, schools reopened, displaced families resettled. Today, as whispers of renewed tensions flicker, Abiy stands as Ethiopia's guardian, not its tormentor. To shield him from the war crime accusations that haunt like specters, unproven in full by impartial courts, often amplified by biased echoes, is to honor the peace he forged. Investigations by the UN and African Union must proceed, holding all sides accountable, the TPLF for their provocations and atrocities, federal allies for any excesses in response. But let us not convict a Nobel laureate on hearsay. In the end, Ethiopia's story isn't one of genocide scripted by a single hand, but of a nation's fight for survival against division's tide. Abiy Ahmed, the reformer who tamed borders and unlocked freedoms, deserves our safeguarding, not as immunity, but as recognition of his strides toward a brighter Horn of Africa. As journalists like Hasan sharpen their quills from afar, let truth be the compass, a war born of the TPLF's gambit, quelled by a leader's grit, and remembered for the peace that followed. Ethiopia endures, united and unbroken under a shepherd who, despite the storms, guides it toward dawn.
የአልጀዚራው ጋዜጠኛ በትውልድ እንግሊዛዊ የሆነው መህዲ ሐሰን ከጌታቸው ረዳ ጋር ያደረገው ቃለ መጠይቅ በዩቲዩብ የሾርት ቪዲዮ በአልጀዚራ የዩቲዩብ ቻናል ተለቆ አይተነዋል። ጋዜጠኛው በኢትዮጵያ ላይ ቢያዝድ የሆኑ ቃለ መጠይቆችን በማድረግ ኢትዮጵያን ያላግባብ መክሰሱና ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትራችንም መወንጀሉን ተመልክተናል። አንድ ጋዜጠኛ በጦርነቱ ወቅት ወይም ደግሞ ፖስት ዋር ላይ ተገኝቶ የፎረንሲክ ምርመራዎችን የዲጂታል መረጃዎችን ቃለ መጠይቆችን እንዲሁም ገለልተኛ የሆኑ አካላት ያጣሩትን መረጃ በአካል ቀርቦ ሳይመለከት እንዲሁ በደፈናውና በሐሜት ብቻ የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ጄኖሳይድ ፈጽሟል ሲል ለጌታቸው ረዳ ቃለ መጠይቅ ማድረጉን ተመልክተናል። የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት በትግራይ ጦርነት ወቅት ያደረገው የጦርነት ክዋኔና ክስተት የህግ ማስከበር ዘመቻ እንጂ የጦርነት አዋጅም አልነበረም። የቲፒኤልኤፍ ወያኔ ኃይል በኢትዮጵያ መከላከያ ሰራዊት ላይ ሰሜን ዕዝን በማጥቃት የመጀመሪያውን ጦርነት ከፍቷል። ጄኖሳይድ የፈጸመ ከተባለስ ቲፒኤልኤፍ ነው መሆን ያለበት። ቲፒኤልኤፍ በዚህ አላባራም። ወደ አፋር ክልል ዘልቆ በመግባት እንዲሁም ወደ አማራ ክልል ዘልቆ በመግባት በርካታ አካባቢዎች ላይ ጄኖሳይድ መፈጸሙም ይታወሳል። ለምሳሌ ያህል በጭና፣ በማይ ካድራ፣ በሰሜን ሸዋ እንዲሁም በአፋር ክልል የተለያዩ አካባቢዎች ግልጽ የሆነ በማስረጃ በመረጃና የጅምላ መቃብሮች አሁን ሁሉ በሚታዩበት ሁኔታ ላይ ቲፒኤልኤፍ ጄኖሳይድ ፈጽሟል። የኢትዮጵያ መከላከያ ሰራዊት ግን የፈጸመው ጄኖሳይድ በግልጽ ሪካርድድ ሆኖ በመረጃና በማስረጃ አልታየም። እንዲያው ጄኖሳይድ ፈጽሞ ሊሆን ይችላል በሚል በጥርጣሬ ነው። አቶ ጌታቸው ረዳም ሲጠየቁ በዚህ ዙሪያ ግልጽ የሆነ መረጃ አልሰጡም። ለምን? መረጃው ስለሌላቸው ነው። አቶ ጌታቸው ረዳ በእርግጥ አልጀዚራ የሚባለው ሚዲያ ለኢትዮጵያ መልካም ዘገባዎችን እንደማይሰራ እየታወቀ ወደ ሚዲያው መሄድ ነበረባቸውም። ሆኖም ግን አቶ ጌታቸው ረዳ ወደ ሚዲያው ከቀረቡ በኋላ ትክክለኛ መረጃ መስጠት ነበረባቸው። ይሁን እንጂ የመደናገጥ ስሜት ይታይባቸዋል። ምናልባት አቶ ጌታቸው ረዳ ሳይዘጋጁ ወደ ቃለ መጠየቁ የገቡ ይመስላሉ። የአልጀዚራው ጋዜጠኛ መህዲ ሐሰንን ባክግራውንዱን ማጥናት ምን ሊጠይቅ እንደሚችል ቀድሞ መረዳትና መገመት ብልህነት ነበር። ከዚህ በፊት አቶ ጌታቸው ረዳ ባደረገው የአልጀዚራ ቃለ መጠይቅ ላይ የተሳካ ቃለ መጠይቅ አድርገው ተመልሷል ይመስለኛል። አቶ ጌታቸው አሁንም እንደዚያ ነው የመሰለው። የአልጀዚራው ጋዜጠኛ አጠቃላይ አልጀዚራ የሚባለው ሚዲያ ስለ ኢትዮጵያ ከዚህ በፊትም የተዛቡ መረጃዎችን ማረጋገጫ የሌላቸው እንዲሁም የተራ ወሬ የሚመስሉ መረጃዎችን በማሰራጨት ላይ የተጠመደ ሚዲያ መሆኑም ይታወቃል። በትግራይ ክልል የኢትዮጵያ መከላከያ ሰራዊት የፈጸመው አንዳች የጄኖሳይድ ወይም ያስገድዶ መድፈር ወንጀል ካለ በገለልተኛ አካል ይጣራ ሲሉ ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር ዶክተር አብይ አህመድም ተደምጠው ነበር። ይህ ማለት የመከላከያ ሰራዊታችን ግልጽ የሆነ በመረጃና በማስረጃ የተደገፈ የጄኖሳይድ ወንጀል በትግራይ አልታየም ማለት ነው። በጦርነቱም የተሳተፉ አካላት በርካታ ከመሆናቸው አንፃር ሁኔታውን ለመለየት አስቸግሮ ሊሆን ይችላል። የተከበራችሁ አድማጭ ተመልካቾቻችን እናንተስ ይህን የተዛባ ቃለ መጠይቅ እንዴት አያችሁት? በተለይ ጋዜጠኛ መህዲ ሐሰን ሆን ብሎ የተዛቡ ትርክቶችን በመፍጠር በሀገራችን ላይ ያልሆኑ ስሞችን ለመስጠት መሞከሩና የተዛባ መረጃዎችን በመያዝ ኢትዮጵያን በዚህ ደረጃ ወይም ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትራችን እንዲህ አይነት ስም ለመስጠት የሞከረበት ምን እንዴትስ አያችሁት? በምንስ አግባብ ተመለከታችሁት? አቶ ጌታቸው ረዳስ የሰጡት ቃለ መጠይቅ ትክክል ነው ብላችሁ ታስባላችሁ ወይ? ለምንስ በእንደዚህ አይነት ሚዲያዎች አቶ ጌታቸው መቅረብ አስፈለጋቸው?